welcome to the League of Women Voters webinar about ranked choice voting, sponsored by both the League of Women Voters Hawaii and by Civil Beat, the excellent online news source that's based in Honolulu but covers statewide and national issues. I'm Sherry Bracken, and I'll moderate today's discussion. I've moderated dozens of candidate and issues forums over the last 25 years in my role as a radio news reporter. I am retired from that, but as you can see, still moderating forums. We have three people with us today to talk about ranked choice voting. Janet Mason is on the Legislative Committee of the League of Women Voters of Hawaii. Aloha, Janet. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Nathan Smith is an attorney living in Kealakekua, but he's from Maine, and he was on the Portland, Maine Charter Commission that vetted and then decided upon ranked choice voting, so he can give us some very practical experience. Aloha, Nathan.
Aloha. Thank you for having me.
Finally, we have Chad Blair. He's the politics and opinion editor for Honolulu Civil Beat and a longtime news reporter, including with Hawaii Public Radio. Aloha, Chad.
Hi, Sherry. Thanks for the HPR plug. We still do HPR reports.
I know. What can I say?
And hello it's in my blood, exactly. And hello to Nathan,
it's in our blood.
To Janet as well. Good to be here, everybody.
So for those of you joining us live via either Zoom or YouTube, we invite you to submit questions by putting them into the chat, which is down at the bottom of your screen. We've already gotten several questions from people as they signed up for the webinar, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can during this 90-minute webinar. We plan to conclude at 5 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. The webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on YouTube. You'll be able to find that recording by going to the League of Women Voters Hawaii website. And if you're viewing this on Zoom, we recommend that you put it in gallery view, which should show you the four of us who are going to be speaking. So, what is ranked choice voting? According to the Congressional Research Service, which has been part of the Library of Congress since 1914, ranked choice voting, or RCV, is an alternative voting system that allows voters to rank multiple candidates on a ballot in order of preference. The Congressional Research Service says that ranked choice voting has been adopted in at least 50 jurisdictions across the United States, including for most races in Maine and Alaska. And ranked choice voting is used elsewhere. In Australia, for example, and it's even used by the Oscars for people voting for all those many movie choices. Sandy Ma of Common Cause, writing in Civil Beat in April 2022, said, "Ranked choice voting is a simple election reform that permits voters to rank all candidates in a particular race from favorite to least favorite. It's just that simple." And her opinion was that with ranked choice voting, sometimes, particularly in Hawaii, some people feel like they know the outcome of an election before it happens. And she said ranked choice voting makes that a little less likely because it allows more choice in candidates. So today we're going to explore ranked choice voting, which will now be used here in Hawaii in specific circumstances. And we want to take a look at the arguments for ranked choice voting, as well as talk about concerns that have been expressed. Before we take a look at this and turn to our three experts, let's watch a video produced in Alaska by an organization called Get Out the Native Vote, which is a nonpartisan effort in Alaska to mobilize Alaska Native and American Indian voters. Michelle, could you please start that video?
Candidate with the strongest overall support to win and reduces the need for runoff elections. Here's how it works. Pretend you're deciding what to eat for dinner and you have 4 options. Instead of voting for just one, you rank all 4 with the one you want most at number 1. It's important to rank all 4 because if your number 1 choice doesn't win, you still get to have a voice in who the next choice will be. Let's say you want salmon, so you rank it number 1. But if you can't have salmon, you'll take berries. And if berries aren't available, you'll eat herring eggs. And in last place, muktuk. Everyone else ranks their 4 options. Now let's count everyone's votes. With ranked choice, a winner must get the majority of all votes. more than 50%. Salmon is ahead, but only has 7 votes. It needs at least 11 to win. Berries and herring eggs both received 5 votes. Muktuk got 3. Since none has a majority, we eliminate the one in last place. Sorry, Muktuk fans. We're going to count your second choice. 2 for berries and 1 for herring eggs. But none has gotten 11 votes. So we do not have a choice that the majority of people agree on yet. Let's eliminate the one now in last place. See ya, herring eggs. So the people who voted for Muktuk and the people who voted herring eggs did not get their favorite choice. But they still get to have their voices heard because we're going to count their second choice. And we have a winner. Even though more people voted for salmon as their number 1 choice, berries got the most total votes, which means more people overall voted for berries. And that's how ranked choice voting works. Shanann.
Thank you very much. Now, we're here in Hawaii, and so let's talk practical things. And I'd like to turn first to Janet Mason of the League of Women Voters. Janet, I know that the Hawaii State Legislature has approved the use of ranked choice voting in specific situations. So please tell us at this point when Hawaii will be using ranked choice voting.
The legislature passed Act 47 last year, approved by the governor, that permits the use of ranked choice voting for special elections of federal candidates, vacant seats, and vacant seats for county council elections. The act is already effective. It took effect in 2023, but it is a limited experiment. So we would have to wait until one of these seats became vacant to use the approach.
Well, so here's a question. When you say a special election for a federal office or county council, when would a special election be necessary? Give us an example.
A special election might be necessary if one of the incumbents died or resigned.
Okay.
I remember when Neil Abercrombie resigned his federal representative seat to run for governor, we had a special election.
Okay, thank you. Would Hawaii voters still vote by mail as we do, except for those who need assistance or want to vote at a voter service center? Would any of that change, or would that still be true in a ranked choice voting?
That would still be true. Hawaii
Okay.
would try to conform ranked choice voting to the rest of our election laws.
Great. Now, I understand that this year, this legislative session, there are a couple of bills relating to ranked choice voting. Give us a real brief overview of those, please.
There's a bill in the House, House Bill 1444, and a bill in the Senate, Senate Bill 401, which are very ambitious, but they're pretty much the same. They propose introducing ranked choice voting for all elections in Hawaii.
Okay, great. Has the League of Women Voters taken a position yet, or you still have to study the bills?
We took a position last year, which, by the way, is the first time we fully supported the idea of ranked choice voting, because by that time we had been convinced by research evidence and other elections that voters do understand these ballots. But we said at that time, and it's still the case, that we think having a limited experiment, if you will, with ranked choice voting is appropriate because this is the first time we'll be using it.
All right, thank you. Now, Nathan Smith, let's turn to you. You're here in Kealakekua, but you used to live in Maine. You were on the Maine City Council. You became, or the Portland, Maine City Council. You became the mayor of Portland, and you were on the Charter Commission that looked at ranked choice voting. You have practical experience with it. Give us a little overview of what your experience was in Maine.
Well, it was interesting because the Charter Commission recommended it, and it was a new concept. Well, it's pretty new in the country, really. There are a few places that had tried it. But when it was recommended and adopted by referendum, and the first election we had, it was for mayor elections. We essentially extended the term of mayor. and for mayoral elections. And there was always a concern, it's been frequently expressed, that ranked choice voting is confusing to people because of the choices you have to make. Well, we had a perfect storm. We had 15 candidates for mayor. So people got a ballot where instead of 4 choices, you had 15 and you had 15 columns. And interestingly enough, the rules are the same, and the rules are pretty basic, and anybody can follow them. And they did. I'll give you the numbers in a minute. But you get 1 check mark per column. That's your first choice. 1 check mark in the second column. That's your second choice. And you can only put 1 check for each candidate. If you do anything else, the ballot gets thrown out. So the question might be, well, how did the Portland, Maine voters do, being presumably no smarter or less smart than any other voters in the United States? Out of 20,000 votes cast, 400 people didn't fill it out. They may have just not wanted to vote for mayor. They may have freaked out at the form or whatever. 130 people mismarked the ballot. 130, which is a very small percentage, and everybody else got it right, which is a phenomenal result. And that goes to show, in that case, the first time out, that people figured it out. They paid a little bit of attention to it and figured it out. So,
Well, how do they actually do the vote counting? So thank goodness only 130 out of 20,000 couldn't manage to do it, you said, but how are the votes actually counted? Kind of walk us real briefly through the process that was used for the Portland, Maine mayor election.
yeah, and what happens in ranked choice voting, and it's important to keep in mind, even though you can, if you want, you can vote for all 15 people. You don't have to. You could vote for 1, you could vote for 3, you could vote for 5. But what they do is they figure out, they add up who got the first choice votes. And you imagine a bunch of piles from the biggest pile to the smallest pile. And on your right, let's say it's the smallest pile. You then remove that smallest pile and you look at those ballots and you say, okay, who were their second choices? And you redistribute those in the other piles based on who the second choices were. And keep in mind that the premise of ranked choice voting is that it takes 50% plus 1 to win. The idea here is a true majority, not just a plurality meaning more votes than anybody else got. And so you keep doing that. And in the first election we went all the way to the very end, where we eliminated all 13 candidates until we got down to 2. And the election was only decided when the third to last pile was distributed.
And at that point, number 1 got 51% or more than 50%.
And at that point, the person who had the largest pile won. They got more than 50%. And that's what happened. And that can be done by computer. If you have ballots that are standardized now, you can do that. In Maine, they did it. I'm sure other places, they keep the paper ballots. So if someone doesn't trust the computer, they can go to the paper ballots and do a recount and confirm it was done properly. In theory, a computer could do this in 10 minutes if you have all the ballots fed into the system. So it depends on assembling all the ballots in big complex states, with thousands of miles between voting places. It can take a while to get all the ballots in one place, but you can theoretically do it very quickly if you choose to. Yeah.
Well, so that brings up a question that Janet Mason, maybe you can address, and possibly Chad, you know the answer. Does the Hawaii State Elections Office say it has the capability with our computer systems to handle ranked choice voting to get those votes counted? Janet?
That's a very important question. Right now, the Office of Elections has confirmed that their voting system can prepare a ranked choice ballot. However, we have over 870,000 registered voters in Hawaii. It's relatively complicated to complete the tabulation of the votes, particularly, like me, if you have perhaps 15 contests on your ballot. the Office of Elections is working closely with Hart Civic, that's the election system provider, to adapt the tabulation software to the specific rules in Hawaii about how votes can be tabulated. We are lucky because Hart Civic is already working successfully with at least 2 other jurisdictions to do the same thing. So I think the short answer is yes, they can produce a ranked choice ballot. No, they are not ready to tabulate them statewide.
Really, that's kind of concerning. Nathan, did you say that the votes in Portland, Maine were counted by computer or manually?
They were counted by computer, and that was now the first time that happened was about almost 10 years ago now. And what happened was that first of all, they photocopied all of the ballots. So they had electronic record of all of the ballots in addition to having the hard copy. So they had the photocopy, the hard copy, and then they put it into a system that essentially read the ballots and calculated based on what they had in front of them, that calculated the result, and they had ways of double testing and all that kind of thing. But the answer is it was done. Interestingly enough, they only let the information out one at a time. So there was suspense in announcing the final election, and there were no leaks. No, it didn't get leaked who actually won. They knew before the final announcement, but it was all within the same hour that they let the information out. You could see how the votes moved around from different supporters to different candidates. But it can be done. We live in an age when far more complex tasks are undertaken by computers. We rely on them every day. And that's a matter of time. It does involve some initial expense. You have to have the software or the computers that can handle that. But we can talk about in a minute, the other issue, which is, but by saving the effort of having runoff elections, it makes life a lot simpler. Yeah.
Janet, just a quick question before we go to Chad, because I want to get his input. Did the state legislature allocate any funding to deal with ranked choice voting?
They did not. And if we needed to have a ranked choice election today, they would need an emergency appropriation to complete the software development for 871,000 potential ballots and many contests for each district. They are working toward this. They are working toward assembling the specifications for doing this, but they don't have an appropriation.
Okay, thank you. Now, Chad Blair, you've written in Civil Beat an op-ed about ranked choice voting and how it might work here in Hawaii, or might have worked in some past Hawaii elections. And in September 2022, you suggested that ranked choice voting might in fact improve Hawaii elections. Tell us more.
Thanks. And by the way, I hope once we get to one of these ranked choice voting elections, I'm hoping our elections office will produce a video as nice as the one that we saw from Alaska. I'm going to have to look up what muktuk is. Muktuk. I'm thinking.
I don't think you want it.
Well, I probably not. And apparently voters on that video did not. But what would it be? It would be spam musubi, manapua, malasadas. I don't know. But it's a nice, user-friendly way to understand this. Yeah, thanks for bringing up that editorial. I think it was Janet that mentioned.
Chad, I just want to interrupt. It's whale blubber. Thank you to Michelle Spark, who's looking from Alaska. Thank you, Michelle.
Oh boy,
go
thanks,
on,
Michelle.
Chad.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Janet mentioned earlier the Abercrombie race. That was 2010. Neil Abercrombie, after 20 years in Congress, decided he wanted to be governor. He did, of course, eventually win that race. He didn't make it in re-election 4 years later, but that set up a special election, a special federal election, the very kind of race that is under this new law, along with the vacant county seats. It was held in May of that year because Abercrombie resigned in February. I think we had a vacant seat for about 2 months or so, and it was winner take all. And the winner ended up being Charles Dejoux, a Republican. And when I say winner take all, you could vote for, didn't matter what party you were all running from. But Charles Dejoux managed to win with just a plurality of the votes. He defeated Ed Case and Colleen Hanabusa, two prominent Democrats, as well as a whole nother lineup of people But he didn't last long. He would end up serving in Congress only for 7 months. Ed Case would drop out of the primary race in August. I think it was August, might have been September. And then Hanabusa went on to very handily defeat Charles Dejoux, who was, by this time the incumbent in the U.S. House. And so that's an example of where I think it perfectly epitomizes how this would work. Dejoux would very likely have never got in there, or it would have come down to either Dejoux Hanabusa, Dejoux Case. And I think then the second choice, or the, if you will, the consensus candidate for most voters would be the person that we would choose. It's not just that race. There were several others. I can mention them. It is in that article, and I'm hoping somebody will post it in the chat here so everybody can see it. But by my count, it was at least 8 races over the last 10 or 15 years in which, if we had ranked choice voting, we very likely would have had a different victor, and very much would have changed Hawaii's history.
Chad, I was reading your article, and then I remembered that I had moderated a candidate forum for U.S. House in, I believe it was 2006.
Yep.
10 Democratic candidates. There were 2 Republicans, and there was 1 nonpartisan. And we had them all at Kealakekee High School. And I looked back yesterday at the results, and the winner on the Democratic side, 10 candidates, happened to be Mazie Hirono, and she got 20.7%. And the next finisher was Colleen Hanabusa at something like 20.5%. And then many other people. And all of these people were fairly prominent. But what happened was the 20.7% winner went on to the general election. And that, all the examples you cited in your really well-written article kind of point out that things could be very different if we use ranked choice voting, especially when we have lots of candidates.
I'm glad you brought up that race. I too was at Hawaii Public Radio at the time and moderated a debate with those very same people, although Clayton He had to cancel at the last minute. But yeah, Mazie Hirono, who is now our U.S. Senator, defeated Colleen Hanabusa, who herself would go on to be elected twice to the U.S. House. But remember who else was in there? Gary Hooser, the former state senator from Kauai, Brian Schatz, who today is now the senator along with Mazie Hirono, Ron Minor, a council member and a legislator who just passed away. And even the 2 Republicans were fairly well-known people, sort of moderate traditional candidates that might well have represented the state. Had ranked choice voting been in place, who knows how that would have come out, and who knows how our history might have changed because of it.
So here's just a quick question for Nathan. If you have a race, for example, with 10 candidates, or as you said, there were 15 for the Maine or Portland, Maine mayor, do you have to rank all 15 or all 10, or can you just pick 4 or 5 who are your top favorites? Because clearly people aren't going to know everything about 15 candidates.
Right. The answer is you can pick one if you want, but that takes away your place at the table if your favorite candidate isn't a finalist, because once that one candidate has dropped out of the race, you no longer have a say in what happens after that. I wrote, because of the sheer number, I remember writing an op-ed piece for the newspaper there in Portland saying that one strategy was to pick maybe 3 to 5 candidates who were your favorite people you knew about, and with the other caveat that one of whom was likely to win, and pick your top 5 and not get hung up on people who were very unknown. But I remember I voted for all 15, and the editorial page editor said to me, Nathan, who was your last candidate? And I couldn't remember, okay, who the last candidate was. So that's how obscure it got, at least for me, how obscure it got. But voting for one is a bad idea because you lose your place at the table. But if you're informed enough, and that's one of the duties of a citizen, is to get informed, then you have a chance of picking people who are likely to be in the mainstream, one of whom is likely to win. And you may have opinions about that. If you do, that's the way you want to rank.
Chad, what can you add to that?
Well, I actually wanted to add to what Janet said earlier about the no funding. And if you want to come back to that later, that's fine. I don't want to jump on Nathan's point there, but I did want to comment on whether our elections office is ready to handle this or not.
Well, let's go to Janet first, because you had your hand raised. Did you want to add something about voting
Yes,
for one or versus many? And then we'll talk about the funding.
this is a perfect example of the fact that Hawaii voters need help in selecting candidates. That's why the League is strongly supporting House Bill 718, which would provide candidate statements from every candidate running in Hawaii races. So it would make it easier to compare and contrast the candidates and then rank them. Having that bigger voter education piece would enhance ranked choice voting.
Well, my personal view is that it'd be great if the state provided that for every single race, ranked choice voting or not, plus when we have ballot initiatives. When I was working and I did a weekly interview program, I often had the League talk about the Hawaii County charter amendments, pros and cons, because otherwise people just don't know. But Chad, what about the funding? Talk a little bit about that, because clearly the funding is critical to be able to implement ranked choice voting, and maybe even critical for the education portion.
I'd like to make a couple of points. The first is to Janet, what Janet was saying. There is legislation this year proposed to have a voting guide, an election guide. By the way, Alaska has a terrific election guide. It tells you everything you pretty much want to know, including the do's and don'ts, how to mess up your ballot if you're doing ranked choice voting, and a fifth grader could understand it. So Alaska folks really have it smart. California has that. There's printed versions, there's online versions, it's translated into several languages. Our own elections office has been resistant to do that, in no small part because the legislature has been resistant to give more money to the elections office. And that to me is frustrating. But let me just tell you this, when we switched to all mail balloting just 2 years ago, generally a success, hopefully it will stay that way, we are saving money. We're not having people being paid to man precincts in public schools, right? Cafeterias and auditoriums. And there's been a lot of money saved. Plus, you can still vote in person. You can still walk in. You can still sign up that day. But I think the elections office position is that's not our job. A voting guide is not our job. Well, you know what? The legislature could pass a bill and make it their job and fund it. And it would all be helping voters understand who's on the ballot, what are their positions, those ballot measures you mentioned, charter amendments, constitutional amendments. We really need to have that voter education.
We do. And you know, when you said that the legislature has not allocated funding for education, that leads to questions that have come up about ranked choice voting. Does ranked choice voting favor the incumbents? Does it favor Republicans? Does it favor Democrats? Chad, what's your position on that?
Well, of course, it hasn't happened much. I mean, besides Maine going first and now Alaska, this is the first time, and they've implemented it for all the elections. And the one election that we all know about was Mary Peltola, the first Native Alaskan or Alaskan Native to be elected to the Congress. She won both the special election and to fill the remainder of the term of Don Young, who passed away, and then she won the ultimate election as well. Took a while to count the votes, but Sarah Palin, the former Alaska governor, former mayor, of course, was the running mate of John McCain, as well as Nick Begich. I believe he was is the son of a former lawmaker there in Alaska as well. And folks in Alaska, if you're tuning in the chat, just correct us and let us know what the deal is there. But if you look at the numbers, and others analyzed it as well, some Republicans, including Palin, said, oh, it's just not fair. It's only going to favor Democratic candidates, and you know, you just can't have this happening. But in fact, if you look, the analysis that was done is that a consensus candidate emerged in Peltola. And I think, frankly, Sarah Palin had just sort of did her time there in Alaska, and people were tired of her. And it was a process of elimination. So we'll have to see more races going forward. And Alaska is really the test case here, but I don't see any evidence of it. The only criticism is coming from conservative quarters. Thank you.
Well,
Nick Begich was the grandson of the first elected congressman. Thank you, Michelle.
Good thing Michelle's here to keep us straight. Well, I looked back at the results of that election too. This morning on Nextdoor, somebody posted that the Alaska ranked choice voting was terrible. And so I looked at it, and I looked at a Pew Research study article, as well as your, Chad Blair, your op-ed, which talked about the Alaska voting. And Mary Peltola, who was the ultimate winner, in the first go round, she got 40% of the vote, ahead of both Palin and Begich. And so if by chance they had just gone with the plurality, like who gets the most votes, she actually would have won anyway. But the
Right.
interesting thing was Nick Begich got knocked out. He was the third one, but obviously more of his voters, Republican voters, voted second choice for Mary Peltola, not for Sarah Palin. And Mary Peltola ended up winning it with something like 51.5%. Sarah Palin ended up with 48.5%. So
Let me just add one other thing back to the elections office, if you don't mind, and then I'll shut up for a while. The biggest problem our elections office has is that they cannot release the results, both in the primary and the general election, until all the voters have counted. And as we saw, it's happened many times in Hawaii, there's still people standing in line at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. when the polls close. They can't turn them away. They have to let them finish that. And so we have to wait 4 or 5 hours. That's the biggest frustration. If ranked choice voting, an RCV election happens, it's going to take even longer, because as with the case for Alaska, I think it took at least a couple of weeks. There we are, Sarah won by a plurality. Thank you, Michelle. But the patience, the impatience. Remember Trump on election night of 2020 saying, frankly, I did win, right? Because he said, just stop counting the ballots, because early on it looked like he did pretty good. But that's because all those absentee and mail-in ballots hadn't come in yet. So I think the elections office can handle it. Can the people handle it? Can they be patient enough to wait for those results?
well, the other thing is, now that we have voting by mail, if people vote by mail, their ballot will be in. It was
Yep.
people who were standing in line who still wanted to vote in person, who particularly on Oahu were there till not just 6, but 7, 8, 9 o'clock,
Yeah.
and you're sitting around waiting for the results. But you're right, it's patience on the part of the people.
Yeah.
So is ranked choice voting more helpful in federal, state, county, local elections? On Oahu, we have the neighborhood boards, don't have those on Hawaii Island. But should ranked choice voting be used for some, but not other types of races, federal, county, state? What do you think, Chad?
I think that, frankly, I was surprised with mail-in balloting, and I think Janet can correct me if I'm wrong, but initially it was going to be a pilot project on Kauai. Isn't that right, Janet?
That's right.
And I thought, well, that's great. Hawaii sometimes likes to test the waters carefully to see whether it's going to look how long it took with medical marijuana or gay marriage and or death in dying legislation. It takes a while. These are progressive issues. They're difficult issues. But I think what happens is those two bills that Janet mentioned that are before the legislature right now, I don't think they're going to pass. I think they're going to wait and see how this works. That tends to be the way our legislature, which is fairly cautious in a lot of areas, and frankly, fairly conservative. I mean, there used to be Republicans in that body like Cynthia Thielen who were more liberal than some of the Democrats. And right now there's a very strong conservative element in both the House and the Senate. So I think we're going to be careful of moving too quickly on this. I will say one other thing, the vacant county races, it was prompt in part because of a case here on Oahu between Trevor Ozawa and Tommy Waters. In fact, they were two very close elections, basically Hawaii Kai and Waikiki. And that was very confusing. They had some votes that came in late. They had to recount them. But in answer to your question, Sherry, I think we're just going to go slowly with this.
Part of my
Sherry,
question, though, Nathan, weigh in. Is ranked choice voting most useful for federal, state, county, or for any election?
I'd like to back up for 1 second and I'll get to that. Okay.
Okay.
And this is because it's a very important issue and it's in the press a lot. And that is the question of whether or not ranked choice voting is a scheme by liberals or Democrats to somehow hijack elections. And I think it's worth pointing out, Chad's exactly right. There's not much history, period, in the United States. But in Australia, where they've had ranked choice voting for 100 years, for example, until the recent Labor government, there were 9 years of rule by a conservative government, which points out that conservatives could get elected, and they were ruled for 9 straight years using a ranked choice voting system. So I think when people do their homework, they'll discover the system should be relatively neutral. Obviously, the specifics of any jurisdiction can have some impact on that. The other question you asked was, do incumbents get favored by it? And I would suggest that no more than they do in any other race. Name recognition will always be a big deal. And the antidote to getting too comfortable with incumbents is to pay attention to the League of Women Voters and get more information about candidates, and hope that the legislature will wake up and fund what they can to make voters more informed. On the issue of which elections are best, ranked choice voting only makes sense if you have more than 3 candidates in an election. So any election where you have 3 or more candidates, it makes sense to do that, because you're able to figure out sort of you're able to get a mandate for candidates by getting a 50% vote. If it's just a plurality vote, you'll never know whether the 60% or 59% of people who didn't vote for the winning candidate, the one who got 41%, can't stand that candidate and would prefer either of the other two if they had to choose between the one who actually get the plurality and the other two. So the way to settle that issue is to go on and have ranked choice voting and find out where people's backup choices land. So anyway, that's enough for the moment.
Chad, what do you want to add?
I did want to add to the part that there's bias, that somehow it's a built-in prejudice towards liberal or Democratic candidates. And thanks, Nathan, for reinforcing that. Yeah, it's still too soon in many ways. But I think one reason that we are cautious, when I say we, I mean the legislature, is that Hawaii is dominated by one political party. It is the Democratic Party. It has been that way since statehood in 1959. We had 2 Republican governors, but one of them was there for a very short while. The numbers are overwhelming. It's a Democratic state. And more so, our elections really, it's the primary election that really determines the outcomes, not the general. And I think there are some Democrats, incumbents, that feel threatened by this system because, to be honest with you, about 28-30% of the people in Hawaii did vote for Trump, do vote Republican. You can see it on the numbers. It's fairly consistent. And I'm not making a judgment on that other than to say there may be a Democratic dominated state, but we are not all Democrats, and for that matter, independents, Greens, Libertarians, whatever you want. So I do think the power structure that exists doesn't want to change that, and that's why I think we'll be cautious. Another reason.
Janet.
I might add a
Wait, and Nathan,
sorry, let's hear from Janet. You wanted to hear from Janet. I'll wait.
Yes, thank you.
I just wanted to mention that I believe we're making slow progress on the issue of voter education. This afternoon, there was a 2 p.m. hearing on House Bill 718, the voter education bill. The Office of Elections pretty much endorsed the idea of candidate statements in a pamphlet, but surprise, there were objections from the Attorney General and from the Legislative Reference Bureau about their proposed roles in the voter education. And that had to do with publication of a plain English version of what the ballot measures meant and a pro-con analysis of the ballot questions. So slow progress, perhaps, but it would certainly help if people testified on that.
One of the questions, Janet, that came in was whether there would be a sample ballot provided in advance. My recollection is that even for our regular election, I was able to look at my ballot online. Was I not? Or did I invent this in my head?
At least since 2020, people can look at their ballot online at the district and precinct level.
Right. Okay.
And that's a great tool.
So in ranked choice voting, we would expect to see the sample ballot online, hopefully with an explanation, so people could, if they wanted, look at it in advance.
I think so. That's my expectation.
Okay. The question has come up as to whether ranked choice voting is workable in both partisan and nonpartisan elections. Oh, wait, I forgot. Nathan, you wanted to add something.
Well, just an observation about Chad's point. I couldn't agree more that if you're in complete control, you might say, of the political agenda, why would you change something which works for you? And that's a challenge. But I would suggest a slightly different perspective, and that is that one thing about ranked choice voting is it enables you to, if you have one party that's dominating, it still enables you to find out about the strength of other candidates and other ideas in the party. So it's a way of the party tempering itself, becoming a little bit tougher, a little more adaptive, and adapting to change and not getting stale. Because anybody who's done a lot of politicking knows that a lot of party politics is showing up, being there year in and year out, helping with the fundraising and everything else. And sometimes parties need a wake-up call. And by having more candidates able to be in elections, even if ultimately the Democrats end up voting for the mainstream winner, the one who's always won, you can learn a lot along the way. So I would suggest it could make the Democratic Party, any party, stronger, Republican or Democratic, because it'll give them a better read on where their voters are.
In presidential elections, the voters are not really voting for president. They're voting for an elector who will then vote presumably for their candidate of choice. And most states are winner take all, but I believe that Nebraska and Maine are two that actually allocate their electoral votes based on the popular vote. So the question is, how would ranked choice voting affect presidential elections? And is there a problem if some states are using ranked choice voting and some are not? Chad?
I don't know. Alaska, as I understand it, is the first one to have it in federal elections, and it wasn't a presidential election in 2022. It is coming up in 2024. Maybe
Right.
the Alaska folks can chime in. It's a terrific question, Sherry, because let's just call out the elephant or the donkey in the room. I think the Electoral College is a very flawed way to elect people to lead this country. There's no other country in the world that has a system anything like it. It's antiquated. It was changed in the 1860s after Lincoln, I think, 1870s, and made even worse. And there's actually an effort to try and to reform the Electoral College. Frankly, the way we select senators is disproportionate to the population as well. The fact that Wyoming has 2 senators and so does California doesn't make any sense. So I don't know how it's going to affect the Electoral College. Having said that, the Electoral College is still here, even though the winners of the popular vote at the last couple of elections, last 20 years or so, did not win because the Electoral College goes the way it was determined.
Sherry, I might add something to that. Portland, Maine just had a referendum on this very issue because they have one election every couple of years where they're electing 2 city councilors at large. So you get 2 votes basically out of a slate of people. There might be 10 people running and you get 2 votes there. And they adopted ranked choice, or they charged the city council with coming up with a ranked choice system that would allow for electing multiple candidates, which is in essence what would happen at the presidential election in Nebraska and Maine, as you mentioned. So my immediate answer is I don't know exactly how it works, but I think the requirement would be everybody would get two votes, so to speak, and the winners would have to get more than 50% to win that elector. And and I'm not sure how it works out. And it may be if only one winner gets more than 50% and nobody else does, when all the ballots are counted and however they divide it, then the presidential candidate gets both of those votes, not just one. They don't get split between the 2 candidates. But there is an answer out there. I just afraid we can't give it to you right now. Yep.
Janet?
In general, operation of the elections is delegated to the states. And so if Hawaii was using ranked choice voting and we selected presidents, say, using ranked choice voting, I think the rest of the Electoral College would just chug along with Hawaii's result.
Well, it doesn't sound like there would actually be any change because each state decides how they select
That
the
is-
electoral college delegates,
That's right.
right?
Yes.
And
No.
even then, some electors have been faithless, including here in Hawaii. A Bernie Sanders supporter refused to back Hillary Clinton in the 2016 race when it went to the Electoral College. And I mean, of course, Trump won the Electoral College in 2016, but so-called faithless electors. And there's been I think Janet might know, but I think there is some legislation to say, you shouldn't do that. You should vote as the party did, as the voters did when you go to vote in the Electoral College.
I think you've explained it well just by your discussion, but I don't know if everybody's heard the term faithless electors. So Chad, just define it real clearly. So people
Thanks
know
for
what
putting me
you're-
putting me on the spot. I mean, the reality is the people don't actually elect the president. We actually have electors in each state that are selected by the parties and others who then go and cast those votes. I believe it's in December. Of course, this is the very same electors that are ratified on January the 6th in the case of the 2021 attack on the Capitol. But essentially, you're representing the vote, and you're supposed to vote ideally for who won, proportionally depending on the actual votes that you earned. But you can, in fact, switch that, and it has happened several times. There's no punishment. You're not going to get. You might get kicked out of the party, but there's no financial punishment that I know of. It's not a crime. That's another reason why the Electoral College is just so silly. It really should be one person, one vote. The majority wins, but that's not the way it works. So I don't think I explained it very well, but sorry.
No, you did. You did. The thing is, the Electoral College was created way back when.
Yeah.
Now there's much more communication. Interestingly, I'm listening to the audiobook now, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power by John Meacham. And he talks about this very thing, the Electoral College, and it wasn't all that popular with everybody back in the 1700s. Anyway, I digress. Janet, you wanted to add something.
I just want to add a little bit about the Electoral College and the faithless elector that Hawaii had in 2016. When that person did what Chad described and voted for a candidate different than the party had recommended, there was already a law making this illegal.
Good point.
However, there was no remedy about what to do about it. This year, the legislature is going to correct this, I believe. There's already a bill requiring that if the person should do it again, anybody does it again, they would automatically be replaced by another person selected by the party. And that's what we need to do, because this is completely contrary to democratic principles to do something like this.
Of course. We have a question that popped up in the chat, and I'm not clear exactly what it means. The question is, in ranked choice voting jurisdictions, to what extent are voter education materials provided by the election offices? And as I asked that question, I've not lived in California for nearly 30 years, but when I did, we did get from the election office all of the voter education material, but it wasn't prepared by the election office. But Nathan, who prepared the education material in Maine? And
Well,
Chad, Janet, what do you know?
Yeah, early on, what happened was, of course, Portland adopted ranked choice voting, and not too long after that, Maine did. And you can go on the Secretary of State's website, I think, in Maine, and you can find information about ranked choice voting. What happened was in Portland was there was a very active print media at the time. There were weekly newspapers. There was a robust daily newspaper. And of course, with the shrinking of those institutions, it raises a question: who's going to fill that gap? And in theory, you can find stuff online, but everybody's so inundated with online information, it's difficult. So I think it's a bit of a challenge, and it's another argument in favor of having the state be more proactive about this and provide information. And there's a way to do it in a relatively neutral way. Let the candidates describe themselves in their own words, but you might have some objective questions that they could answer. Yeah.
Janet, the League of Women Voters, in their arguments for ranked choice voting said they thought it would increase voter participation. And we live in a state where I don't think our voter participation is near what it could be. Why do you think ranked choice voting would improve voter participation?
Well, I think presuming people participate and buy the idea of ranking candidates, I think people are willing to live with their second choice, or, most voters are realistic. If I don't get my first choice, maybe I could live with this person, and so on. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing decision.
One of the positives that's been cited about ranked choice voting, and I was quite surprised when I started looking online because it was in an awful lot of places, is that it would increase civility in elections. Why is that important? And does ranked choice voting really do that? Chad has kind of got a little smile on his face, and I know Nathan can have some input. What do you think, Chad?
Yeah, again, with the caveat that this just hasn't happened enough for us to judge whether civility, of course, that's key to civil B, right? Civil.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Exactly.
A little plug.
But one of the analysis that was done on the Patola Palin Begich race was that Palin and Begich really went after each other quite a lot, and they were somewhat mean. And I wasn't there. I live in Hawaii, not Alaska, but Patola, a fairly level-headed person who, by the way, knew Palin. They served, I think, before. They had a long history. And really the more traditional and moderate candidate seems to be the preferred. A Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think, is maybe one of the most famous examples of a very polarizing figure. And I suppose you could identify someone from the Democratic Party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right, from New York. But they're also representing parts of Georgia in the case of Greene, and parts of New York in the case of Ocasio-Cortez, where they're representing a lot of people that are like them. But in larger races, I do think the more uncivil person, we'll see. We'll find out whether it turns out to be the case or not. You'll basically a majority of voters will say, it's just not right. That really is, I want someone who's not going to be a raging radical, rather either left or right.
Nathan, what was your experience in Maine relative
Yeah,
to civility?
well, let me give an example of how this works on the doorstep when you're trying to get a vote. Let's assume, Sherry, that I want to get your vote, and Chad and I are both in the race. And I know or suspect that you'll say to me, you say, Nathan, I've known Chad for years, and I think he's great, and he's got my first choice. Or maybe I don't know what choice he has, but here's the issue. If I know that you may be strongly in favor of other candidates in the race, and I want a vote from you, I may not get your first vote, but I may want your second vote. And so if I want to get your vote, knowing maybe that Chad is your favorite choice, I'm not going to say bad things about Chad. If I want to distinguish myself from him, I'll say he supports this and I support that, but he's a great guy and he'd make a good candidate. I think I'd make a better one on, for these reasons or on these issues. And I hope you'll give me your second choice vote if you won't give me your first choice vote. Why would I say bad things about Chad and anger you and lose any vote that I could get from you? And who knows where Chad will rank when they add up all the ballots. Okay, he may drop out somewhere before I do, in which case I want your second choice vote. And so that dynamic, and that dynamic is real. I mean, that's a real dilemma that people will be facing. And candidates who go after each other will run the risk of alienating voters who are looking around for other candidates to support if they're just being nasty. So there's going to be a drift to moderation, I think, and that's a long, long overdue need in American politics. Yep.
Well, your likely opponent in the race, Mr. Chad Blair, would like to make an opposing statement.
No, I don't necessarily agree with. I think Nathan was very eloquent about it. I do think we also have to be realistic that there is something going on in this country right now, a division. We saw it at the State of the Union last night with people shouting down the president. The leading candidate, the only declared candidate for the Republican Party in 2024 is Donald Trump. And there are polls showing him doing well, some less. And he's already attacking Ron DeSantis, his most likely formidable challenger. And we know the Donald Trump playbook. He puts people down and gives them names, and it worked. With the other reality that he did lose by 3 million votes in 2016, and he did lose by 7 million votes in 2020. But there is this appeal in this country, and not just this country, to channel that anger that a lot of people feel, that alienation. And in that regard, I would hope ranked choice voting might help be civil. And let me just give you one other example. If you remember, Trump was competing in a very wide field. So was Biden. I believe it was the largest ever field in 2016 or 2020. Multiple candidates, including Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, running for the Democratic Party, which he has since left. But Trump really managed to prevail with 25-30% of the vote. Had there not been all those candidates, or had there been a ranked choice voting, which kind of weeded them out, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. It might have been a Marco Rubio. It might have been a Ted Cruz. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but we'll see it. We're not going to see this at the presidential level nationally. Alaska, however, is going to have that. But Alaska is also not an early voting state when it comes to the primaries and caucuses. So I'm going to throw that out there. So
Alaska and Hawaii don't tend to sway the nation, given that we're so small. And to your point, Chad, conservative commentator David Brooks, I heard him on PBS NewsHour last Friday, and he made the comment that most of the Republican primaries are winner take all, even if the winner gets well less than 50%, because sometimes there are so many candidates. And that is what reminded me to look up that 2006 election, where there were 10 candidates in the Democratic Party alone, and the one who advanced to the general election got 20.7% of the vote.
right.
She might have won anyway, but
People tend to forget that Ted Cruz actually beat Donald Trump in the Iowa caucus, and then Trump went on, but he lost other races as well. But there were so many people, and you wonder how that might change. It's interesting, by the way, that the Republicans are not changing the caucus primary system. It's going to be Iowa and New Hampshire, 1, 2, some of the widest places in the state, whereas the Democratic Party has moved to have South Carolina go first, a very diverse state. And then that's going to be, I don't know exactly, I can't remember. It's Nevada, Michigan, Georgia, and New Hampshire, somewhere in the mix. And forget about Iowa. They're just going to bypass it altogether. And Biden has argued for this, that it reflects the diversity of the country.
Janet, you wanted to add something.
I just want to add that if we move forward with ranked choice voting without a candidate comparison published by the Office of Elections, I think we're going to encounter a lot of guesswork for the races where there are 10, 12, maybe even 12 candidates, and nobody wants that.
Well, even right now, when we have multiple candidates, and I will use Hawaii County Mayor as an example, we have had 10 candidates for Hawaii County Mayor, and in the last time that happened, which was not the most recent election, but there were a few well-known names, but there were a whole lot of names that I didn't know. And it definitely took a lot of work to figure out who those people were. So
for those
we do
who
need
are
election
following
material.
for those who are following the chat, I put in an item about the Alaska election guide, voter information. It's just terrific. And then others put in about California, and Hawaii needs this. Janet's absolutely right. That is going to take money, but this is voter education, and I believe it's essential.
Well,
I want to correct myself too. There was a comment in the chat room. The voter education bill is House Bill 716.
not 718, right? 716.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, we do need voter education, and I can see why some incumbents might find it not beneficial to have people learn about issues and people.
Sherry, I have another
Wait.
comment to follow up on Chad's point, if I might.
Okay.
Chad mentioned David Brooks pointing out that a lot of Republican states have plurality winners in their primaries. The irony behind the Republican paranoia, at least among some, about ranked choice voting is that the best way they could assure that they would get the strongest candidates would be to have a primary that used ranked choice voting, because then they would get the candidate who had the true consensus support, as opposed to the person who could just get the most of a relatively small plurality. And I've maintained for a long time in Maine, for example, I said the party that first uses ranked choice voting in the primaries will have a leg up on the other party until the other party wakes up and realizes it's a way to strengthen their candidate selection process, because they get a candidate that represents a broader base in the party and is going to be a stronger candidate in the general election.
That even people in the other party might embrace or at least vote for. In Hawaii County, well, in the state, when we have multiple candidates for an office, they are listed alphabetically. A question that somebody raised is, in ranked choice voting, would candidates be listed alphabetically, or how? How did you do it in Maine, Nathan?
I think it was probably alphabetic, but that is not required by statute. I think it'd be interesting. I think a better way to do it would be do it by lottery and just list them any which way, Yeah. In other words, draw a lottery for the candidates and you get 1 to 10 in the numbers and you show up wherever your name shows up. Yep.
Janet, was there anything in legislation that dictated how they'd be listed?
Oh, yes. There's nothing in the ranked choice voting bill about the order of candidates, but there is in this session a bill that appears every other year or so about the order of candidate names on the ballot. This bill proposes 2 things. First, that the names on an individual ballot for a specific district would be selected randomly for a precinct. And then after that, the names would be rotated across precincts. So if we had this arrangement kind of layered on top of ranked choice voting, it would indeed be complicated.
Chad?
Yeah, Janet's right. That bill comes up again and again, and it won't pass because it just makes too much sense. But it should be random. I mean, there's a reason why. There's a reason why Dan Akaka never lost a race, and I believe his granddaughter got elected to OHA and Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and it is an advantage, and it should be randomized. That's just this really just makes complete sense.
So the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank that mostly focuses on public policy issues, and they've been very influential in US politics. It published a paper on ranked choice voting in 2019, and they said ranked choice voting is not a good thing, that it's a scheme to disconnect elections from issues and allow candidates with marginal support from voters to win. Thoughts and comments, Chad, Nathan, Janet? To me, it made no sense, but I want to ask about it.
I mean, the Heritage Foundation has its own biases. I do think they're onto something when they say it might be about personalities and rather than issues, and most of us don't pay very close attention to the issues. It's the old line about who would you rather have a beer with, George W. Bush or Al Gore. And ironically, George W. Bush stopped drinking because he was an alcoholic, and of course he ended up winning but losing the popular vote, as we all know too. I'd actually rather have a beer with Al Gore. I think it'd be a much more interesting night, but I do think we tend to vote for personality. The real problem is we really should be paying attention to the issues. They are essential. I think that was clear last night in the State of the Union, where these wokeism and things like critical race theory and so forth, cultural issues, are really the playing card of Republicans right now, because they sense the Democrats are vulnerable on that. When there's Democrats last night talking about, are we going to really cut Social Security and Medicare? I mean, those are issues. Those are things that we should be paying attention to and discussing over the kitchen table. But I hate to say it, there's sort of a dumbing down of the American people. Remember how they used to talk about the Lincoln Douglas debates back before the Civil War, where people would go and stand for hours, and listen to people go back and forth and talk about issues, not put each other down, not give each other some sort of cruel nickname, but talk about the issues. And of course, there was no more important issue than slavery and whether it would be expanded to the other states, which of course led to the Civil War. So I'm worried about that because I've seen the dumbing down of the American electorate.
I'll weigh in a little bit. First of all, on the argument that ranked choice voting is a scheme to disconnect voters from issues, I think for the reasons we talked about earlier, it probably has the opposite effect. Because if, the typical arguments in elections are so-called ad hominem arguments against the person. If you take arguments against the person out of the conversation, what's left? What's left is what issue, where you stand on the issues. And that forces people to talk about that, where they stand on the issues, and often to sometimes join forces with other people that have similar issues in common and build your, pool your resources and advertise for both of you in the theory that then you can get higher ranked choices from the voters. So I think they're just wrong about that. The second thing, to say that it allows candidates with marginal support to win, that's completely untrue. In order to win the election, you have to be chosen by people. And if you have marginal support, there's no magic that can be done that's going to get you ranked higher by people that don't feel like ranking you higher. So it's a silly argument. I'm surprised. I would have thought that if it had a little more, forgive me the word, integrity in writing that report. Okay.
Janet, did I see your hand raised? Did you want to add something?
You did. Once again, I need to clarify one of my remarks. There is no randomization of names on our ballots. However, the order of the parties is randomized in a drawing.
Right. Okay, perfect. But then inside the party, it's alpha order at this time.
That's right.
Okay. We have a viewer who wants to have us just go through the mechanics again. Nathan or Chad or Janet, whichever one of you wants to do this. Just how does it work? I pick my first choice, is Nathan, my second choice is Chad, my third choice is Janet. If Nathan doesn't win, Nathan, explain how the votes get counted.
Yeah, and I'll go through it. The important thing to keep in mind here is that there's another name for ranked choice voting, and it's called instant runoff voting or instant runoff elections. And the idea behind that is that by selecting more than one candidate, the process we talked about, and I'll go through it again. What happens is when you fill out the ballot, you'll have a series of columns. Let's say there are 5 candidates, and there'll be 5 columns, and that's your first choice, your second, your third, your fourth, and your fifth. And in each of those columns, you get one check. So you scroll down till you get the candidate you want, and you give them a check for your first choice. You go to the second column, you pick another candidate. You can't pick the same candidate. You pick another candidate, and that's your second choice, and so on. So what happens is, if nobody gets 50% plus 1 of the first choices, if they do, the election's over. There's nothing else that happens. But if nobody gets 50% plus 1, you then have a runoff election, but it's done instantly. And what happens is you drop out the person who got the lowest first choice ballots. You take that pile of ballots and you redistribute them to the other candidates based on the second choices. So each pile might grow a little bit. And if still nobody has 50% plus 1, then you go to the next lowest candidate. You take that pile of ballots and you distribute among the others. And if nobody has 50% plus 1, you do it again. And eventually you'll get down to 2 candidates, at which point one of them will have more than 50%. I hope that helps.
And you only have to go to the polls once. You pick your most favorite, your second favorite, your third favorite.
And we've just had 3 runoff elections.
Yeah.
And the voters didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to get a babysitter for the kids. They didn't have to go to the voting booth. They didn't have to remember to mail in another ballot. You know, none of that happened. They did it all in one election on one ballot. They made their choices. Yeah.
Well, some of that which I've read about that's positive is in fact that a lot of people just cannot take time off to vote. Now, we here in the state now have mail-in voting, which is great because you can do it at home no matter what your working hours are, whatever. I'd like to kind of ask a closing summarizing question before I give each of you an opportunity to make a closing comment. You know, they say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So the question is, do you think ranked choice voting is better than our current system? And if so, why? And Janet Mason, let's have you go first, because League of Women Voters did support the idea of going to ranked choice voting on the previous bills. Why? Why is this better than what we do now?
It's better than what we do now because the basic principle in our democracy is to choose elected representatives who have received a majority of the vote. And this is not happening in many races in our country. As we know, it's possible to win a race when you have not achieved more than 50%.
Okay. Nathan Smith, what do you think? Is this better than our current system of voting? If so, why?
Certainly in any election where there are more than two candidates, I think it is better. I agree with Janet. She's got that dead on in the first instance. Secondly, I think what it does is it frankly it will invigorate the parties a bit because it'll enable them to have more candidates within the parties that can challenge the status quo. Whether or not they prevail remains to be seen, but it will do that. It will also provide more civility in elections for reasons we've talked about and talked around a bit. And finally, I think it will also deal with the issue of voter fatigue by simplifying elections and avoiding the need for runoff elections in those situations where there are runoff elections. And so I think it would be a good thing. Hawaii, under the current situation, maybe doesn't need it as much as some states, but it's a good long-term improvement to our democracy.
Well, before I let Chad talk, I just had a thought. When you talk about eliminating an election, for example, if you didn't have to have two elections, you could only have one, that would save the state money. And maybe they could put that money towards voter education, which is what is sorely needed here. Chad, what do you think? Is ranked choice voting really much better than what we do now, and why?
I just don't know. But why not try it? And we are going to try it. I'll say two things. It just has always frustrated me here. You go into the primary, and Janet was talking about the randomization of the parties and how they're listed. I remember, if I recall, the ballots back when you went into a voting booth, right, and you filled it out in paper. You can still do that, but the ballots were colored, and you could only pick one though. You could only pick the Democratic ballot. This is the primary, the Republican ballot, the Green Party, whatever the case is. But in the general election, you can vote for whoever you want. If you want to vote for a Democrat for the U.S. Senate, or a Republican for the House, or a Green, or an independent, or a nonpartisan candidate. So why is it different? Why is the primary so different than the general election? Well, it's because the Democratic Party likes it that way. It has helped to maintain the system. And I'll add one other thing. We also have very inconsistent ways of appointing our officials. Think about it. The House and Senate, our legislature, there's no term limits. There's legislation to propose it. It would have to go before voters. I don't think it's going to happen. And yet we limit our governors and lieutenant governors to 2 4-year terms. We limit, I believe, all the county council races. There might be a prosecutor race on one of the counties, but mayor, council, prosecutor, they are limited. And remember this, those races are also nonpartisan. They used to be partisan. You used to have Democratic mayors, Republican mayors, but that's not the case anymore. But that is still the case with the legislature, and for that matter, Congress. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is none of it's uniform, and change is a possibility. And ranked choice voting, I think, an experiment, but one we should try, because I really do share the view that Nathan and Janet do, is that it's probably going to give us the best overall candidate that is going to win.
You know, as you were talking, Chad, I was hearkening back to somebody who came to fix my irrigation, and he asked me in the nonpartisan mayor races on this island, the primary, and actually for county council, same thing.
Yeah.
If you get the required number of votes in that, there is no general election for you. And this person was saying, well, I didn't get to vote for mayor. There wasn't a mayor race in general election. And really, our primary is our general election for these nonpartisan races. And a lot of people really don't understand that, because we still call them the primary and the general, the implication being that there will be a general after the primary. And, you know, the four of us on here are kind of policy wonks. Not me, I'm not so policy wonkish, but I am interested in voting and in learning about candidates. And a lot of people really don't understand that there may not be a general election. So,
oh, just building on that point, remember on the Big Island, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's you have to get 50% plus one to win outright for mayor.
Yes.
Is that correct?
yes,
Not on Maui. On Maui, it doesn't matter. In this case, it was Richard Bisson and Mike Victorino. The
right.
top two people advance to the general election. So it's different. It's home rule. It's county rule. I get that, but it's confusing. And I would love to have some uniformity here. And I think ranked choice voting could help. I'm just going to call it RCV.
That's good. I like no abbreviations until we're sure we know what they mean. But I think by now, if people have been hanging in there with us for a little more than an hour and 15 minutes, they know that we are talking about RCV, ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
So, Janet, you look like you wanted to add something.
I have nothing else to add at this point. I think this holds great promise for Hawaii. I think we should get Act 47 implemented very well, and then we'll be good to go.
How do we, as the public, support the concept of voter education? I mean, I know that the League of Women Voters is all about voter education. You sponsor candidate forums. I've moderated several of them. Chad has been involved with them, I know. That's a good thing, but how do we support the voter education that would be necessary for ranked choice voting, Janet? Tell us what to do.
Well, I think all of us today in this discussion understand why it's important to have information about the candidates. That's one thing, is to promote that idea, information about the candidates. Secondly, we have to have additional messages like this video broadcast explaining what ranked choice voting is. So I think that's the path going forward.
Is there something we can testify to at the legislature? Is there somebody we should be lobbying?
Oh, yes. You can testify on House Bill.
Come back to the microphone, Janet.
Yes, I'm looking for the note. I believe it's
Okay.
House Bill 716, relating to production of an electronic voter information guide. You can contact your representatives saying we need this. Maybe we have to amend the bill. We can't get everything we want out of the box, but we should at least have the candidate statements.
Okay, and the bill is this HB 716?
That is correct.
Okay, and Chad, you wanted to
Yeah,
add
I'm going to
something?
put something in the tracker here. This, I think, is very much in response to your question about what can we do. It's not just a voter guide. There are actually several bills that are calling for the return of civic education in our schools.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, and I haven't been in grade school or middle school or high school in a long time, but we had social studies. We learned about the Constitution, the three branches of government. And my understanding is that it's no longer quite that way. And what I put in here, by the way, in the Slack channel, excuse me, the chat here, I hope I got it right. Yeah, it lists all these bills from the Dan Foley Commission and others that are generally good government. But one of them is to require the Department of Education to have full-time educators teaching basics civics. There's three other bills as well. And I think that's really been missing for a long time. It should be absolutely essential. as part of, frankly, being a citizen in this country.
Actually, I've heard that from many people decrying the lack of
Yep.
civic education. So at least our younger people, as they come up, know what it is they have the opportunity to do. They know what their role is. They know how to participate. So thank you for that. As we close, I'd like to give each one of you a chance to make any final comments, and then I will remind everybody about where you can find the video. Nathan Smith, attorney, former city council member of Portland, Maine, former Portland, Maine mayor, and member of the Charter Commission, who actually has used ranked choice voting. What are your closing thoughts?
Well, I don't think it's a big secret that we live in a country where we've taken the strength of our democracy for granted, and I think it's in crisis. It's a crisis of legitimacy, and ranked choice voting is one of those things that can help hopefully reintroduce the rational discussion of important political issues that was envisioned by the founding fathers. I think it can also encourage having, not encourage, it can mandate it, in essence, having majority winners win elections as opposed to people who win less than a majority, which helps with the legitimacy of their mandate and their claim to be expressing the will of the people. So I think it's an important step in the right direction. It's one that should be appealing to both parties. And I just hope the country is able to move forward on it in other regions. Yep. And here.
Janet Mason, League of Women Voters, Hawaii, your final thoughts?
Act 47 passed last year is a terrific opportunity for us to, a terrific opportunity for us to invest in a better method for voting. And paired with improved voter education, I think we would have a terrific experiment. The investment in the voter education candidate comparison guide is very modest. It's about $170,000 for an entire election cycle.
That's all?
That's all. Let's do it.
$170,000?
Yes.
Thank you for telling us how much it costs. Okay, thank you very much. Chad Blair, Civil Beat, politics, and what else are you? Politics and
Opinion.
He has opinions.
Can't
And
you
longtime
tell?
news reporter and a total follower of politics, and whose opinion I greatly value. What are your
Thanks.
final
And,
thoughts?
well, thanks to Sherry for moderating this, and for you folks that tuned in. It's pretty remarkable. I'll say two things to close here. Janet used the word experiment. It is a cliche that the American experiment, the democracy that we're still working on, and it does seem pretty dark right now in a lot of ways, nationally in particular. But experiment means to try to come up with new ideas like ranked choice voting, and give it a shot and hope that the best ideas prevail. I also want to give a shout out to the legislature, a body that I have been critical of plenty of times, but they are getting it, and they do get it, and we'll see what comes out of this session. But we wouldn't have had all mail-in balloting had not groups like the League of Women Voters and
Pause.
Thank you. It's been a long day for me. I apologize. Common sense. They should change it to common sense.
Yeah.
Common Cause Hawaii. Thank you, and others. And they did eventually come around, and now it's the law of our state. They did allow ranked choice voting, mind you. It's only in the special federal elections and the vacant county seats. They are considering bills on a number of issues to deal with what arose out of the Kalani English, Tai Cullen, Kealoha, Connie Sherrod, you name it. The moral crisis that the Foley Commission has described in our body politic here. And I'm hopeful, but it really comes down to you, the citizen, making yourself heard, and not just the same people, not just Chad writing an editorial or Janet going and writing another piece of testimony. It's got to come from people in people's districts, and it's got to come in large numbers, because they will listen because they want to be reelected.
That's a very good point. And as you were talking, I was thinking about this audiobook that I'm listening to by John Meacham, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. discussion and discourse was the name of the game as our democracy was being formed and reformed in the early days, and we certainly can do that. I want to thank everybody who joined in this webinar today. I particularly want to thank the League of Women Voters and Honolulu Civil Beat for sponsoring it, for Janet Mason with League of Women Voters being one of our guests, Nathan Smith, an attorney, and Chad Blair with Civil Beat for sharing their mana'o. You may see this video online via YouTube. You can find the link on the League of Women Voters Hawaii website. It should be up there by tomorrow after they get it posted. And I really do want, and it's actually right there, a recording will be posted right on the website, as you can see in the chat. Thanks to everybody who is here. And I really do think we need to keep the conversations going. Like Chad said, you know, we need to talk about this and also make sure our legislators know how important this is to us, not just ranked choice voting, but just trying to achieve a better way of being here in the state, here in the country. So with that, we're going to conclude. I want to say thank you to everybody who is involved in this. Donna and Michelle and Holly, who with League of Women Voters, who took care of all the technical details, much appreciated. Thank you all, and a very warm aloha.